Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Pittsburgh Public Schools October Budget Workshop and Business and Finance Committee meeting. Today is October 7th, 2024. My name is Gene Walker, President of the School Board, and I am filling in for Director Emma Yord, who is out on maternity leave for a little bit longer. So tonight we have three agenda items. The first is a presentation from the Pittsburgh Public School Finance Department and Ron Joseph on our budget, a presentation from the Pittsburgh Land Bank, and then a special kind of agenda item, a board conversation regarding the proposed community facilities plan that they are asking for a presentation on. So we will start with Mr. Joseph. And the floor is yours, sir.
Good evening. As Mr. Walker mentioned, tonight is the third and final of the required by board resolution budget workshops. So in the past budget workshops, we went over a kind of a timeline of how the budget's developed. We went over some areas that we were looking to investigate within our budget, as well as just a breakdown of how the budget works in our overall financial context. So the goals of tonight's workshop, one being to provide an update of our current finances, and then two, to provide a preview of the preliminary budget. So this will just be a high-level overview based on looking at the major spending categories and revenue categories. In November, when we released the budget prior to that at November's Business Finance Committee meeting, that's when we will have a full-blown budget presentation. So if we look at our finances through August 31st, you find that, and that's August 31st, 2024, not 2023, you'll find that we are projected to have a slight surplus at this point in time. And we'll get into some of the categories that are leading to that. But looking to next year, we're projecting a $23 million deficit, and going out into 2026, our deficit is projected to grow to $33 million. At the end of 2026, we will have not enough fund balance in our reserve to be able to balance the 27 budget. So these are some year-to-date comparisons. So that will lead you to see how we're projecting and how we're coming in better than projected. So our earned income revenue is up compared to this point last year, and our real estate revenue is relatively level with last year's earned income revenue. One second.
Hey, Dave, we can see the presentation on the Zoom, but we cannot see it on the monitors here in the room. Are you able to change that?
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Take two. So as I mentioned, provide an update on our finances and a preview of the preliminary budget. So this slide shows our forecast that you're familiar with. These are actually through August 31st of 2024, so current year, not as of last year's. Apologize for the typo. We're projected as of this point in time through the actuals, through the first 8 months of the year, to have a slight surplus, but taking our budget that we're building right now, it's projected to have a $23 million deficit, with that deficit growing in 2026, leaving us in a position where we would not have the reserves to balance a budget with a deficit in 2027. So based on our budget actual comparisons year-to-date, year-over-year compared to through August, we see that we're ahead in terms of earned income tax. We're relatively level with last year with real estate taxes, which is a good thing because of all of the drops in property values in the central business district. We're kind of level with where we were last year, so that's having a positive impact on our forecast. But again, appeals are being heard every day, and as those value changes come in, that can have an impact on the current current real estate taxes that we may have to refund for the current year. Real estate transfer taxes are ahead of last year as well, so that has a positive impact on our forecast. When we look, and those were the local revenues, so when we're looking at our state revenue, it's up from last year, and this has a lot to do with increases in the state budget that we've had over the past 2 years. Our special education subsidies also a little bit higher because of increases to our special education subsidy in the budgets of last year and for the upcoming year. The current school year that we're in, our Social Security revenue is higher than it was last year, but a lot of times where you look at the Social Security and retirement, those are timing issues, and when we get the subsidy from the state, sometimes there's they exhaust their appropriations, and then we get a prorated share, and then when the new budget passes, then we'll get those numbers, the revenue in that was due to us in the prior year. So with the Social Security and retirement, those are timing issues, and we have received more transportation subsidy this year than we did last year. If you look back to last year, we were overpaid, I believe, in 2022, so the state had to recoup, overpaid in 2021, state recouped that in 2022, still recouped some of that in 2023, so now we should be in a better standing for the transportation revenue that we're supposed to get and kind of back to slightly around those pre-pandemic. Oh, so time's out.
Your mic looks like it's the one we use for public hearings, and it has like that 3-minute thing on it. So it's going to go off on you every 3 minutes.
So when it starts flashing, if someone can, Dave, if you can fix that. If not, when it starts flashing, just give me the high sign and I'll turn it off and turn it back on. All right, so when we look at our expenditures compared to last year, salaries are around the same place, and that's where we're seeing a lot of our lowered costs and salaries, that being vacancies that we have that we're unable to fill, as well as any salaries that were originally budgeted in general fund that we used ESSER funding to fund those costs, as well as new funding that we got from the state in terms of increase in Ready to Learn funding that have been able to fund positions that were previously budgeted in general fund. Our benefits costs are higher because of increases in healthcare, as well as the schedule increases to PSERS. Special education revenue, that's just I didn't know if you were giving me the wave because, okay. So special education revenue, it is slightly lower, but that's again the timing issue. Our transportation revenue costs look a lot higher, but that's also when the state recorded cost for special education transportation. Charter expenditures are up by $4 million, and the largest increase that we've seen are our tax refunds. So last year at this point, we had paid $1.7 million in prior year tax refunds. This year to this point, $8.1 million in tax refunds for prior years. So that would be tax refunds for the 2023 tax year and prior. So when we look at the preliminary, and this is a preview of the preliminary 2025 budget at a high level. So as stands right now, the budget expenditures for the 2025 budget are at $735.9 million. This represents a 2.64% increase over the 2024 adopted budget. The deficit in this budget is actually $6.7 million less than the 2024 budget. So while there's still a sizable budget, that budget is reduced due to increases in state funding and better than projected earned income revenues that we've been seeing. So that helps. Thank you, Ted. So that has helped to reduce that deficit. So as I was able to illustrate in the multi-year forecast on the first slide, this budget does not maintain the 5% fund balance compliance threshold that we have, which our unassigned fund balance should be 5% of our budgeted expenditures, at least at that threshold. And based on the assumptions through 2025, it does not meet that threshold. This budget does not include a millage increase, so a tax increase is not included in our planning for the 2025 budget, but there'll be a couple of scenarios to show the impact of that when we get into discussion about the revenues. And ESSER funding has ended. So as of September 30th, that was the end of the obligation window, so we could not have any expenditures incurred past that September 30th date. So that budget is no longer available to supplement our district's operating budget. So ESSER finished, so that we've reflected any of those additional costs in our budget planning going forward. So on to revenues. So this shows all of our major revenue categories. A few things to point out. So about a quarter of our revenue comes from real estate taxes. So as we see an erosion in taxes in the central business district, that will affect that. So we're making some assumptions for a decline in our tax revenue, but if anything, if our values go down farther than that, then we'll be in a worse position in terms of our projected budget. Our earned income taxes are a little over a quarter of our budget as well, and a little over a quarter of our budget comes from our state basic education subsidy, with $23 million of our total revenue that we're planning to have to supplement our budget coming from our fund balance. So this just shows a breakdown of the major funding sources. So 55% of our budget comes from, slated to come from our local sources, being earned income tax revenue, real estate tax revenue, realty transfer, and about 42% of our budget is slated to come from state revenue sources, which are our basic education subsidy, our special education subsidy, and transportation subsidy, and all other subsidies that we receive from the state. And 3% of our budget is slated to come from our district fund balance. So in terms of the state budget, this may be familiar because I believe we discussed this at a previous month's Business Finance Committee, but we saw a $2.4 million increase in basic education subsidies, so that was about a 1.38% increase. We saw level funding in our Ready to Learn funding. Our CT funding increased by a large proportion, but in terms of actual dollars, about $156,000. We saw about a 1.5% increase to our special education funding, which led across all of our funding sources. We saw $3 million additional state funding. There are also some changes to some additional items that we get from the state. So there was a reinstitution of a form of the charter reimbursement. So this is to fund costs that we reimburse some of our cyber charter costs. So basically, there was $100 million that was allocated statewide, and each district will receive a pro rata share of their cyber charter school cost for the prior year. So this is the allocation for the 2024-25 reimbursement. And there was also a change to the special education tuition calculation. So that is projected to have us to have a $1.4 million savings to the district. So that's a change in the way that the special education tuition rate is calculated for charter schools. So for cyber charter schools specifically. So that's about a $1.4 million savings on our expenditures. So in total, we're looking at about $8.2 million in net benefit from the state budget. So it's another view of the revenues by major sources. We have the pie chart, but this is just a listing and a schedule of all of those major revenue sources. And we look at the areas that had the largest change from 2024 to 2025. Had a 3% decline in real estate tax revenue. We had a 6.5% increase in our earned income tax revenue. Our realty transfer is up as well. When we're looking at our basic education subsidy, I showed those numbers previously, but a 1.38% increase, and our state property tax allocation number is up by almost 4%. That 4%, that 4 million accounts for a 4 million reduction in our real estate taxes. So we have to offset that decrease we have to offset the increase in state property tax reduction funds by lowering our assessments for our property owners who are eligible for homestead or farmstead allocation. So basically, we have to recognize a lowered assessment in that amount. But that's also worked into the total decreases that we're projecting, also with increases for new construction, and that's the total impact on our real estate taxes. And as I mentioned before, a decrease of about $6.7 million to the amount that's needed to take from our fund balance to balance our budget. So when we look at our revenue assumptions, I mentioned we're assuming that decline in real estate revenue due to property assessment appeals, as well as that increase in the state property tax allocation that results in a net decline that we're projecting in our total property tax revenue that we're going to receive. No millage increase, so property taxes are assumed to be level with the 2024 budget year. We're projecting an increase in earned income tax revenue. That's consistently, since we had a reassessment back in 2012, that's been one of our more consistent revenue sources in terms of growth. And we're assuming that our state and special education funding is level with the 2024-25 budget allocation. This is something that we do because we don't know from year to year what the funding is going to be, so we just take a conservative measure and conservative approach to budgeting, and we assume that we'll at least have level funding. And this year, based on the new changes to the funding formula, this year is the base year. This new year is the base year, so assuming that we're not going to get any less than 2024-25, which is the base year. And in this projection, we're assuming that the cyber charter transition reimbursement will not continue beyond 2024-25. That's some reason why we're doing that is because it's not. In school code, there is the mechanism for making that reimbursement, but a set dollar amount is not actually fixed in the school code. So it's likely for the term of the current administration that that's something that will be continued, and we'll kind of weigh those options and go back to see if we can adjust our forecast to at least take that into account for the next 2 years and kind of have that fall off for, I believe, the 26-27 year. So this first scenario shows, assuming that we'll have increases in state revenue, and this is above and beyond what our current projections show, but if we assume that our state revenue would increase and not be level funded in the same by the same percentage of our increases from 2024 to 25, 23, 24 to 24, 25, you'll see that our deficit lowers from 23.3 to just under 20, so that's the impact that it has, and also assuming that there will be continued charter reimbursement. So just updating our assumptions that will have that impact on our upcoming budget. And while we're not including this as part of our preliminary budget, this is the impact of a 5.3% tax increase on the budget. So you'll see that almost a $10 million impact in next year and also in the upcoming year. And we will be in a better position at the end of the 2026 budget year. This year, we have the ability to raise tax by 5.3%. The adjusted Act 1 index, the base Act 1 index was announced for the 25-26 school year, and that would allow school districts at base level to increase taxes by 4%. And this is just to show if we assume the continued increases in state funding, continuation of charter, cyber charter transition reimbursement, and we also assumed a tax increase, that would be the total impact on the budget. So if all of those things held, that our budget through 2025 would be in compliance with the fund balance board fund balance policy, and at the end of 2026, we would have a fund balance that would be just shy of the 5% threshold. So on to expenditures. So for 2025, similar to other years, our single largest line item are salary and benefits. Those comprise about 47% of our budget, with charter schools slated to have impact of 20% of our budget, and special education funding add another 13% of our budget. So this shows the major changes in salaries in all of the major objects. So salaries are slated to go up by 1%, so that's not a large increases for salaries. Benefits up by a little over 2%, 5% increase in special education funding. But looking at the other objects area, that is where we have our line item for tax refunds. So we're anticipating that next year we're going to have somewhere in the vicinity of $7 million, if not more, that we'll be paying out in tax refunds for prior year. But once we get all of the appeals that were filed this year for the 2025 budget year, we'll have a better estimate of those prior year tax refunds. Well, refunds for next year, and also looking at the refunds that are still outstanding for this year. So when we look at our expenditure assumptions, we're assuming a stable workforce, so that means we're not assuming a large reduction in our workforce right now, because we're still operating the same number of schools. We're still educating roughly projecting roughly the same number of kids as this year, so we're not projecting a decline in workforce. We're projecting up to an 11.7% increase for employer healthcare costs. That number is actually going to come in lower than that due to some of the work by our Chief Human Resources Officer. Projecting no school closures, no school renovations or delivery model changes. I know that we are currently in the midst of a facilities utilization plan, but at this point in time, we do not have a voted on recommendation, so that's not something that I'm going to bake into our budget, because if I assume that that is part of our budget and those changes are either not approved or not phased in a certain manner that I'm assuming, that I would assume, then we would not have sufficient appropriation to operate our budget. I mentioned that we're assuming an increase in tax refunds due to property assessment appeals. That's just the climate that we're in right now, so it's wise for us to assume that in terms of our expenditures going forward. I touched on this in the state funding portion, but assuming that there's going to be implementation of the new calculation for the cyber charter school tuition rate for special education, so that's going to be effective January 1st. So we've incorporated that into our projection for charter costs going forward. One thing that we added at the midpoint of this year that we're continuing next year that we reflect in our budget was the additional cost of educating students at the Allegheny County Jail and the Schumann Detention Center. That was a contract that was approved by the board with the Pittsburgh Mount Oliver Intermediate Unit 2, and that's something that we're projecting that we're continuing. And as I mentioned before, ESSER funding has expired, so that is not something that we're using to supplement our district's operating budget. So just a recap of the district's timeline. This was the full budget development timeline starting back last year with the expiration of collective bargaining agreements, and also with the first year of the fiscal year. To date, we've already hit all of those markers. And if we're going to the second half of that, starting with the end of the state fiscal year and the beginning of the state fiscal year and our school year, we're currently right here with the final budget workshop. The next stages would be the release of the preliminary budget slated for the middle of November. We usually have a special budget hearing at the beginning of December. Then at the December legislative meeting, that's when we'll tentatively approve the general fund budget as well as the tax rates for the upcoming year. December 31st is the deadline to adopt the budget by statute, and we do have two of our labor agreements that would expire at the end of this year as well. That was a suggestion to put major markers such as collective bargaining agreements as well as the state fiscal year and other items on the budget development timeline. So that was the last slide, and I will turn it over to Mr. Walker for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Joseph. Questions, comments from board members? Ms. Petrowski.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. My first question is for Mr. Weiss, since I harp on this all the time, but do we have a status update on the lawsuit with Allegheny County on the assessment appeals?
Thank you, Ms. Petrowski. There was a court hearing last Friday, a week ago. County has filed what are called preliminary objections to the school district's complaint. The claim is the district does not have standing to bring this lawsuit, essentially saying it has no legal injury. We, of course, are vigorously opposing that position. The judge, who is visiting judge from Armstrong County, as the local bench is all recused on the case, asked for additional briefs, which are due November the 6th. So that is the status at this point.
Great, thank you very much, I appreciate it.
Certainly.
And then I think I really just have a comment, and thank you, Mr. Joseph, for putting together the different scenarios. And I really kind of just want to point out that even with the opportunity or not to possibly raise taxes, is that it still leaves us in a deficit projected the year end 2026. And I don't know, just kind of sitting here thinking that it's like just really ridiculous that there are all of these tools at the state and we have our own tools of raising taxes and that none of them are good enough. And so like, it's nothing to solve here today. I'm not proposing to raise taxes or not raise taxes at this point, but it almost seems kind of moot at this point because we're not gonna really see much of a benefit of it. But it's, I think, just something for everybody to ponder. That's all, Mr. Walker. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? We will go Ms. Talaferro and then Mr. Udine. Okay, we will go the reverse. Mr. Udine, you're up. If you're speaking, Mr. Udine, you are on mute still.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir, you're up.
Thank you. I want to ask Mr. Joseph if he's been able to isolate the cost of the Schumann Center commitment.
Yes, those costs were listed in the board tabs, that board agenda items that were approved, I believe, back in June. I believe the total cost for both Schumann and Allegheny County Jail, the education of students, they're based on the contract with the IU, is about $2.8 million.
Thank you.
Was that your only question, Mr. Udine?
Yes, thank you.
All right, Ms. Talaferro, you are up.
Thank you, Mr. Walker, and thank you, Mr. Joseph, for your presentation. I have maybe just a few questions and then a couple thoughts. So first, I guess it's page 7. I just had a question about the ESSER fund. So one, did we spend all the money?
We're projected to spend all of it, so right now we're in the liquidation phase. So to date, actual expenditures probably about, say, over 60% of it, but then with contracts that we still have to pay on for the next 4 months, and revisions that we're waiting to hear back from the state on that will account for the remainder of the funds. We're on track to exhaust all of the funds.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess the second part to that question is, knowing that these funds are coming to an end, and a lot of those funds were able to support additional programming and that sort of thing, do we have a sense, or have we identified programming services that those funds have covered, and determine whether or not they're necessary funds that we need to be considering continuing, or will we continue programming that may be identified as working well for our students? I'm not sure who that question should be directed towards.
I can take the first stab at that question. So when we went into planning for the ESSER 3, well, in all phases of ESSER, those expenditures, we wanted to be deliberate in terms of lessons that we learned from the past to not build in recurring expenditures into those funds. So that's why we used a lot of those funds for upgrading technology, upgrading our buildings, adding HVAC to those. So those would be one-time cost, doing curricular adoption. So those, again, would be one-time costs that we can see about 5 years worth of items out of that. There are certain expenditures that we use, such as for some teletherapy providers, which we were able to utilize other grant sources for those. Then we also have some of the school-based providers for socio-emotional health and well-being that were one-time things and also tutoring that were items that were meant to try to address learning loss. So those were very deliberate to be one-time expenditures. One of the things that, in terms of items such as evening school, that was in place but didn't really continue because of lack of staffing. We do know we have our own district credit recovery programs, and looking at how we're delivering those to see if we can kind of fill the void that some of those programs left. But we were very deliberate in terms of the programs that we added in were meant to be short-term, and there were also evaluations that were being done of some of those programs, and hopefully they were able to be completed during the term of this programming, but that will give us insight into some of those things that in the future we might be able to use our existing funding to try to see if there's a way that we can cover some of those expenditures if those programs were evaluated to be worthwhile.
Thank you. The other question that I have, I guess, relates to the potential of us not being in fund balance compliance. And I guess the thought that I have, and could be a question as well, is so what are we going to need to do to address that? Are there policy adjustments that could be or may need to be considered? If not, then obviously reducing our expenditures would be, I guess, how we can get back within. But knowing that there are other factors that are maybe out of our control, things that may continue to be a factor that might make it harder for us to get within that 5% according to our policy. So I'm just wondering if you can talk through like the what if we get to that point and we are out of compliance, then what needs to happen?
So I believe last year the budget was adopted and it wasn't projected to be in fund balance compliance as well. The board policy doesn't mandate a course of action. It just, I believe, states that the superintendent or designate shall develop a course of action to get back into fund balance compliance. It doesn't provide specific steps. I think functionally, having a fund balance that is below that threshold, actually the 5% is probably too low. Having a fund balance that's probably below a month or two of operating expenditures basically puts the district into threat of being at a cash flow cash flow crunch in terms of whenever we have disagreements at the state in terms of funding and we have delays in getting that funding in, that presents an issue for us covering our base cost. But the simple equation is we have to look at ways to reduce our expenditures. A lot of those ways to reduce our expenditures are either being as basically cuts to possible services, programming, staff. That's how you would reduce your expenditures. We spend about 47% of our budget on salaries and benefits, not trying to raise the alarm, but when we're looking at our deficit, it's either cut revenue, raise revenues, cut expenditures, or a combination of both.
Thank you. Not going to be an exciting time to have to think about that, but we have to. So, knowing that we have some of these things that are looming over us related to, our facilities and potential of schools being adjusted or consolidated or changes made, I guess my thought really just comes to then how we need to start to think about some of these other decisions that maybe won't fix the problem, but because we haven't had a conversation about what any changes would be made to affect our budget, I guess it makes me think, like, do we still consider things like a tax increase? Things like, what we can control, I guess now, knowing that that won't solve our problem. There are things that I feel like have been looming over us that we just have not addressed yet. For example, we've talked many times about the earned income tax money that is still being diverted to the city of Pittsburgh, that was put in play when the city was in financial distress, and is still getting that 0.25% of the earned income tax that the school district should receive. That's something that we have had very little resolve on, and how we work with our partners at the city of Pittsburgh. But I think that's something that I think when we're coming into making some of these big decisions about how we adjust and change our school district, that we can't just sit on money that we have no resolve on how we're going to fix that issue or address that issue for future. Things like raising taxes. Jamie asked the question about the county and the property assessments. That's a thorn in our side as well. So I think just what page 15 kind of sparked my thought process of as we're thinking about budget and the future, how we are going to address some of these areas that are kind of on the side that we know probably need to be addressed, but we haven't found a good way to do it. Nobody wants to raise taxes, but also if that is a factor that could help us reduce some of the adjustment we're going to have to make in our district, I also want that to be considered as well. So those are all the questions and thoughts that I have for now, but thank you.
All right. Director Silk.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation, Ron. I'm hoping that, Mr. Joseph, that you could repeat your explanation of why why you are not considering the facilities utilization plan efforts in our next budget just yet. If you would repeat that explanation, but in as much plain speak as possible, so that we can build better understanding around that with the general public.
Let me try to do that very succinctly. I think it would be foolish to build a budget based on actions that have yet to be voted on.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, Ms. Wilson.
Oops, thank you so much. Obviously, we have a lot to consider, and we go through this year after year after year with the constraints that we have. I just wanted to point out that the whole facilities plan that we have been looking at, which of course there is no decision made yet, the whole point was to try to come up with something that would spend our money more wisely and at the same time provide the best education we can for our children. That's where we are right now, trying to redesign our district in a way to get the best bang for our buck. We know that we can't every year raise taxes, raise taxes, raise taxes. We can't, what is the saying? You keep doing the same thing over and over again, you're going to get the same result. And that's what we are trying to avoid. And this, instead of some people looking at it in a negative way, I see it in an extremely positive way in which, as we plan, as we try to mold this into a different format and provide what's best for our kids, it's going to be best for the city overall. It's going to be best for all of our children. And yes, Ms. Silk, you're right for having Mr. Joseph repeat that. You can't put something in a budget. You can't talk about numbers when you don't have a plan, when we don't have anything finalized. You can't project a budget for something that doesn't exist. And I just wanted to be able to say that and point that out. I think that's critical. I think some people are missing the point. Mr. Joseph, you do a great job of keeping our budget workshops as succinct as possible, considering all that goes into it. So thank you. And I thank all that work with you and get all these things together for us. And I'm done, Mr. I'm done.
Thank you.
I'm done.
Yeah, I don't have a lot. I think, this is the third time that I've gone through this, and there are always areas where we can kind of look at what we've done and, say, wow, things are a little bit different. Obviously, we came into this year thinking we were going to have a $30 million deficit, and I don't know what kind of magic worked out, but to erase that is pretty significant. I think I have the same comment every year, though. It looks like, and I get it, we create a fairly conservative budget that, expects the worst revenue and the highest expenses. But it seems like we kind of have a pattern of, over at least the last 3 years, of there being kind of a 3 to 5% kind of difference, which gets us either close to no deficit or into a surplus. And I'm just curious, is there just a philosophy around how the budget gets put together that keeps us in such a conservative range? Or is there opportunities for us to think a little bit differently about how we put the budgets together that don't kind of bring the shock of $20, $30 million deficits?
So every year that we go into the budget process and also throughout the course of the year when we're looking at how we can better project our cost and how our forecasting is shaping up, we try to make tweaks to make sure that we're taking into account as much information as we possibly can, because we don't like go into a year, and even though it's good to come in better, we know that whenever people see that, hey, you're 5% off and you have no deficit when you were projecting a large deficit, that tends to reflect on the confidence that individuals have in our ability to forecast. So I can say that when you have vacancies, that we don't go into the year planning on vacancies, because if we're going to budget for positions, we assume that at some point in the year we're going to fill those positions. We don't go in assuming that we're going to have 6 months of the year, or even the whole year, not filling a position. So the longer we have vacant positions, and if we aren't getting subs, those reflect on some of the costs that we have. The past 2 years, ESSER has helped us out a lot. We've strategically used ESSER to help us with the routine expenditures that we have, our operating cost, and that has allowed us to be able to to lower that, knowing that building up to the end of ESSER, we wouldn't have that luxury. And in the interim, we haven't taken any action as a district to address those costs. So that's one of the big things. When we're building our budget and you have to approve the budget, we probably have 10 months worth of actual data, actual results in there. So if there are any swings in the last 2 months of the year, we can't capture that going into next year in terms of the conservative approach when it comes to state funding. If the state decides, hey, we're going to increase you by 5% and we're being basically level funding at our base level year, then that's something. So we're looking at ways that we can tweak that and whether we assume more increases going forward so that the shock will be a little bit less at the end of the year. But we look at our forecasting each month. We're updating our budget actuals and building that into our model to see how that reflects. So whenever we'll put the preliminary out, that will have most likely all of our budget to actual information through September. But when we put out the budget, it's most likely going to have 10 months of the year and not the final 2 months. So if we're projecting that based on trend that we're going to have to pay out more. If we're projecting based on the trends that we're seeing through the first 9-10 months of the year that we're going to be paying out $3 million more in tax refunds by the close of the year, and we don't, and that's $1 million less, that's something that affects where we come in. So we try as much as we can, but there's some things that are just unknown at certain times, but we identify where we are conservative and we are trying to be less conservative, but not aggressive to the point where we're putting out a budget that looks good but isn't built on sound assumptions, and we end up running into a situation where we think we're doing a lot better than we really are.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I don't say that to say that you're doing something wrong. I don't think you are. It's just, when we're dealing with, 9-figure budgets, $730 million, the 1 or 2% makes a difference. And I don't know, it's hard, I think, for us to communicate that when we're looking at approving a budget that has a deficit, knowing that, that 20 million, 23 million that is, 3.5%, 4%. On my personal budget, that's not a big deal. It's not going to make a big difference. But when you start adding zeros like we have with the school district, it's huge. And so to know that there are mechanisms, I think, within our operations that allow us to kind of address those along the way should hopefully bring a little bit more confidence to folks. Because if you remember, when myself and Jamie and some others came in 2022, we were supposed to be out of money and kind of gone by now. And so the fact that we're continuing to move this forward is a positive sign, even though there's still lots of work to do. The last question, and then I'll let you go. Have you, or maybe this is for Dr. Walters, begun to think about some areas where, program effectiveness isn't where you'd like it to be, or, the outcomes haven't kind of developed in the way that we would expect, that we can potentially, just not do anymore, but doesn't cause detriment to students in the long term?
Yes, Mr. Walker, absolutely. We have been thinking about that, not only through our programs, but our curriculum, through our thinking about the data that we're looking at and what we're seeing from the impact of that data and what the impact would have to remove it, what the impact would have to seek it somewhere else, and what the impact would be for us just to supplement it in some other way. So we have started that thinking.
Excellent. Thank you. I think as we, get closer to November, I think those types of details, those areas where we can consider as a board, where we may be spending some significant chunks of money but not getting the results that we're looking for our students, I think are going to be really important for us to continue to discuss and debate as to whether they have a home here at Pittsburgh Public Schools if they're not serving the purpose of student outcome achievement, so. I will open up just briefly for any other final comments before we let Mr. Joseph off of the stage. Yeah, Dwayne's clapping. All right, thank you, Mr. Joseph. That ends this portion